one place where we have been interested because of their content. We were even talking about earlier in one of the other articles, we were talking about Battlestar Galactica, which is going to be coming to Peacock. And Peacock has been a streaming service you and I think have been interested in from the start, simply because of the ad-based tier. I think you and I are both advocates of ad-based free entertainment. So this is a Deadline article, and it says Peacock sets Apple distribution deal ahead of July national launch. This article is dated May 6th. It says Peacock, the streaming service launched last month by NBC Universal for Comcast subscribers, has set a deal with Apple to be available across the tech giant's devices when it launches in July. The distribution partnership is the first one beyond Cox Communications to be announced by NBCU for the July 15th national rollout. So this is interesting. So what's happening is, and by the way, they touch on this as well. So Peacock is going to be available on Apple devices, which, in a lot of ways, you would think Apple might be trying to push people out of their devices and access to their devices because they're a competitor now with Apple TV. But with Apple Plus. And so Apple is going to take Peacock. And also this article talks about how basically cable, Cox Communications, is going to be offering Peacock, which I think is really interesting. So Peacock is really, I think, looking at kind of a unique model in terms of their distribution and looking kind of almost at all of the above approach. It says the distribution agreement covers the iPhone, iPad, and Apple TV for Peacock's national debut, which is going to be on July 15th. At this stage, it will have a free ad-supported tier with basically 7,500 hours of TV and movie content live and on demand. That's apparently at the free tier because we've been concerned about that, about what's going to be available on the free tier. Now, for $5 a month for non-Comcast customers, viewers can upgrade to the premium level, which will have 15,000 hours of programming. An additional $5 a month brings subscribers an ad-free version. So I think this is interesting on two levels. First of all, obviously the fact that Apple is doing this, that they're going to be allowing this competitor on their hardware, I think is really interesting. And then again, I kind of want to emphasize with these different tiers, will Battlestar Galactica be on that free tier? That's one thing I really want to know. What do you think about this, Dave?
My hope would be that this new Battlestar Galactica would be available on the free tier because it is something that guarantees to bring people back, But on the flip side, I currently pay for CBS All Access, because of the Star Trek content that's on there. So I don't know. We'll have to wait and see what they decide to do. NBC Universal has such amazing content. This is one of those ones where when this comes online, I'm going to be questioning, where can I cut a corner, where can I shave something to maybe look at, the additional hours of programming. I'm just curious. It'd be interesting for me. I'm curious to know not just where the new Battlestar Galactica falls, but where the classic Battlestar Galactica falls in this equation. Where does Knight Rider fall in this equation? Where does all this stuff because NBC Universal's
That's a great question. That's a great question.
What is in the free and then what is in, what's kind of behind the paywall? Because I think we're going to be surprised at the stuff that's behind the paywall versus the stuff that's available for free. Like I brought up before, my wife and I originally got a subscription to Hulu because I wanted to watch Space 1999. It wasn't because I wanted to watch all this other stuff. I literally started paying for Hulu for Space 1999. It isn't even on there anymore, but that was what motivated me, to look into it. The things I watch on Hulu, I don't watch a lot of the newer content. I'm currently making my way through Staying Elsewhere, for example. I mentioned it earlier. I've been slowly working my way through Hill Street Blues for quite some time. I've been rewatching Justified on Hulu. So I'm going to be interested to see what they consider to be like, the come have a taste, it's free crack that's in the 7,500 that's on the pay side versus the stuff that's behind the paywall. I think we're going to be surprised at what is where, because I think these companies have enough data now to know what sometimes someone's willing to pay for and not willing to pay for. So that's what I'm most curious to learn.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, what do you think about the whole deal with Apple, that Apple is allowing allowing them on their platforms? Because my understanding is that's not the case with every one of these streaming platforms coming out. I think Apple is pushing some of them out, or at least initially was planning to. Do you think that's an indication that maybe Apple isn't as serious about the streaming wars as maybe some other people might think?
I don't know if it means they're not as serious. I just think it means that we are beginning to move to that day that we have discussed previously on the show, where eventually, these different services and some of this different content is going to be packaged in a way that's probably a little bit more similar to what we were used to when we were paying for cable.
Right.
Your basic package, but you can also get Starz and Skinamax and HBO for an extra amount, or you can get ESPN, or what I mean. Like I think this is just the early signs that we're going to be headed to that place eventually. Where these different services and stuff, they're going to take all this different stuff and they're going to pack. Like, for example, like if I could just pay for the sci-fi package, you know what I mean, and get a lot of this content that's controlled by all these different entities under one roof, I would be down for that.
I'm surprised that hasn't happened, because, like, for instance, Hulu's a good example. Hulu has like abridged versions of different channels. Like, they have like some AMC content, for instance, but they don't have The Walking Dead, but they have Fear the Walking Dead. You know what I mean? Something like that.
Well, and it gets even stranger because, like, for example, like we've talked before about the weird state of Stargate, where basically MGM has it, they own it, but clearly they don't have the money to do anything with it, So it's just, at one point it was like its own little Stargate app, you know what I mean? And they were rolling out that one show to support it, I mean, they were, I don't know, because that's the thing. It's like that's the thing I always find surprising, and I've mentioned this before on the show. The things that we as fans want to see live on versus what the companies decide, well, we're done with that now. Because sometimes they don't match up. The companies are sometimes willing to throw away something that's incredibly valuable, incredibly lucrative, that they could still be doing a lot with, but they just go, I'm tired of working with this franchise. Just throw it away. Because sometimes I feel like that's really what happens. It's like there's no active Stargate production, so just put it on the shelf over there, But it's like when you think about all those different shows and all that content, you'd think one of these service providers would want it. So that's what I'm thinking. I just think it's the early signs that eventually these companies they're going to have to work together a little bit. Everybody just can't have their own individual channel. I mean, I don't think all brands are strong enough to support. Because if that was true,
well, we know what would be funny is Apple's in a unique position because Apple produces hardware and software, and now they're producing content. They're producing film, video content in addition to all that. There's not a whole lot of other people that do that. In fact, I can't think of another example off of the top of my head. Like, it would be the equivalent of if like Roku decided to start their own studio and they decided to only use their studio on their platform, which of course would probably wipe out the platform. So it's kind of a fine line with Apple, because Apple obviously has Apple TV, a product where they want to say, hey, use this hub to get all your streaming content. But at the same time, they're also producing their own content. It's kind of interesting.
Well, and see, along those same lines, um, well, I'm trying to think of how to state this. I I've noticed with some of the newer generations, there's not a commonality. Now, what I mean by commonality is a lot of us grew up watching a lot of the same things, you know, so that when I reference something, like if I say you big dummy, like some people will know I'm referencing Sanford and Son, and they'll understand what that's supposed to mean. Okay. Um, there just used to be for example, um, Gilligan's Island, like Hogan's Heroes is always a bit odd for me, but there were just like these shows that were in syndication that like there's just a whole bunch of us, we just grew up watching them. And our parents might have watched them when they were new and in first run. So there was a commonality. So when you talk about pop culture, when you talk about sort of those just shows that you watched growing up or whatever, there was a baseline, and everyone kind of knew similar things. People were all familiar with I Love Lucy. People are familiar with Star Trek. People, you know what I mean? There was a commonality. Does that make sense?
Because James points out,
Yes,
because we only had 6 channels. Yep, there you
correct,
go.
correct. But
Yeah, that's not the world we're living in now. So
no, it's definitely not. And that's what I think is going to be weird, is to see the things that begin to emerge as these newer generations eventually get to the point where they can be the decision makers. I'm really curious what kind of stuff that they're going to want to create and see happen. Does that make sense? Because
yeah,
they
to me, I already have a term for this that I use all the time. It's a constant theme I put out on the show. I used it last week on my broadcast, since we didn't broadcast together. I did one on my own. I call it the violent, and I'm not going to pronounce it right. The violent vinylization of media. In other words, it's like vinyl records. So what happens is every market becomes more and more of a smaller market. So I use the analogy of the Tonight Show all the time too. It's like, there was the late night wars where everybody wanted to be the next Johnny Carson, and nobody realized the time of Johnny Carson had passed. That was gone. No one was ever going to be Johnny Carson ever again. He had that specific moment in time where he was it. He was it. Now we're seeing the same thing with all media. We're seeing like smaller markets for very specific shows that are going to appeal to very specific demographics. And that commonality, I think, for the most part, is going to be gone. I don't think that's going to exist, certainly not in the way it used to, with, say, like things you said, like Gilligan's Island or something like that.
Well, and what I mean by that, just to make sure I drive the point home, is just the idea that when you reference certain things, whether deliberately for irony, whether unintentionally or whatever, because it was something that influenced you or whatever, there's a commonality. So you almost have sort of like a visual and sort of verbal and sort of like shorthand, so to speak. And you can throw out an idea, and if someone has the similar experiences, they go, ah, yes, I know exactly what you mean. So it kind of cuts to the chase quicker, because well, I'm just curious to see. I'm just curious to see where we're going to be. So as more of the some of the streaming wars content you've been talking about tonight, it just heightens that idea for me even more. Does that make sense? The idea that we're breaking things up into such small packaged, bits of content, that it creates a different sort of, I think, like creation point in terms of the influence that it's having on these newer generations that are coming up. So I'm really curious to see what kind of things that come out from them, or what kind of things they find interesting or compelling, because it's so isolated from a lot of other kind of more general kind of content. Because I don't know if I'd chosen to, if I could choose to, or whatever, some of the stuff I watched when I was growing up, I don't know if I would have been as interested in it, and if I could have chosen to only consume those things that, I don't know. I'm getting on a tangent. I'm rambling. I need to stop. I'm sure you get the
Well,
understand the gist.
sort of along those lines, James mentions that he says, I'm going to out the new Amazon Prime show Upload. I've never heard of the show Upload, and I don't have Amazon Prime. Is something that you recommend that I watch? Because, like I said, I don't even have Amazon Prime. He also mentions Return of Man from Atlantis. I've never heard of that. I've never heard of either one of those shows, and I don't know anything about them. So I think that that's kind of, in many ways, that's kind of the way we're headed right now.
Well, so Return of the Man from Atlantis, that was actually a genre show that was actually out in the, I think it was mid to late 70s. And I remember Man from Atlantis. They had a comic book series. It was an interesting show. I know my mom used to like it. So there are definitely people, James, that are very familiar with for Man from Atlantis, kind of in the obviously in the show and in the chat. But it's interesting that's kind of what I'm talking about. It's like I don't know. There's just I'm just gonna start rambling again. So I don't want to beat this topic to death. But no, what you were talking before, Eric, about how they're just kind of dividing up groups and dividing up groups and dividing up groups until you have these very sort of eclectic yet very focused sort of niche markets or niche audiences. As they move further away from each other, I always wonder, what kind of things will come from them. But then secondly, how they're going to shape the marketplace moving forward, because it's some very potentially unusual perspectives that can kind of grow within those microcosms. So I don't know. It'd be interesting to see where it takes things.